There is a moment right before your whole world falls apart, where everything feels almost normal. I know that now. I remember standing at the arrivals gate of an airport I hadn't seen in 6 years, carrying a bag that held almost everything I owned, wearing clothes that were slightly too big because I'd lost weight abroad. I remember thinking, I'm finally home. I remember smiling. I had no idea that the life I was smiling about no longer belonged to me. My name is Claire. At least it was, until my sister decided it should be hers. I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not someone who throws accusations easily. I am not someone who exaggerates. I spent 6 years in some of the most difficult humanitarian environments on Earth: conflict zones, refugee camps, communities rebuilding after disaster. I am trained to stay calm. I am trained to assess situations accurately. I am trained not to panic. None of that training prepared me for what I found when I came home. Let me take you back to where this all began, because to understand how my sister could do what she did, you need to understand who we were. Who I thought we were. I was 26 when I left. Mara, my sister, 2 years younger than me, and I had always had what I would describe as a complicated relationship. She was the kind of person who lived in the shadow of every decision I made, not because I put her there, but because she couldn't seem to stop comparing us. When I got into university on a scholarship, she sulked for a month. When I got my first real job at a nonprofit, she told our mother I had always gotten everything handed to me. When I met Daniel, warm, steady, patient Daniel, who I had been with for nearly 3 years before I left, Mara told me to my face that she didn't understand what he saw in me. I told myself she was just struggling. I told myself she needed support, not criticism. I told myself that's what sisters do, they carry each other even when it's hard. I was an idiot. Daniel and I had a plan. I would go overseas for the mission, posting 18 months, maybe 2 years maximum. We would stay in touch, video calls every week, visits when we could manage. He would keep our apartment. We had been living together for just over a year, and I would come back and we would figure out the next chapter together. We talked about marriage. Not in a formal down-on-one-knee way, but in the quiet, certain way that two people talk when they both know where they're headed. There was no rush. We had time. 18 months stretched to 3 years. Then 4. Then 6. That's what humanitarian work does sometimes. It pulls you deeper because the need keeps growing. I won't apologize for that, but I need you to understand, over those 6 years, the communication changed. It became harder to maintain regular calls. There were weeks in remote postings where I had almost no reliable connection at all. Messages would go days without responses on both sides. The relationship stretched thin in the way that long-distance relationships under extreme circumstances do, and somewhere in that silence my sister stepped in. I didn't know this yet. I want to be precise about the timeline of what I knew and when. When I finally returned home, through a combination of medical leave and a contract that had genuinely run its course, I had no idea that anything was wrong. My last messages with Daniel had been warm. A little sparse, yes. A little surface level after so long. But warm. He had told me he missed me. He had told me he was proud of me. He had signed off the way he always had, with that particular sign-off that was ours and no one else's. Or so I thought. My flight landed on a Tuesday morning in October. I had arranged nothing about my return, partly because I wanted it to be a surprise, and partly because the last few weeks of my assignment had been chaotic, and there hadn't been time to plan a proper homecoming. I had Daniel's address, our address, still memorized. I knew which key to use. I had rehearsed the moment of walking through that door 1,000 times in the 6 years I'd been away. I took a cab from the airport. I remember watching the city scroll past the window and feeling something warm and complicated in my chest, the specific feeling of a place that knows you even when you haven't been there. The streets were familiar. The light was familiar. Everything was the same, and I was the one who had changed. The cab pulled up outside the building. I paid. I got out. I took the elevator to the 4th floor because the stairs had always smelled like the neighbors cooking, and that was a joke Daniel and I had, and I was already smiling about it. I knocked because I didn't want to walk in and frighten him. The door opened. And a woman who looked almost exactly like me stared back. She had cut her hair to match mine. She was wearing a style I recognized from my own photos. For one completely disorienting second, I thought I was looking into a mirror that had gotten something slightly wrong, a mirror that was showing me a version of myself that had lived a softer, easier life. Then I recognized her. "Mara," I said, and the look on her face, I will never forget it for as long as I live. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't fear, it was something colder than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for a problem to arrive and had already decided how to handle it. "I think you have the wrong apartment," she said, and she tried to close the door. I put my hand out and stopped it. "Mara, what are you doing here? Where is Daniel?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped back and I saw the apartment behind her. My apartment, my furniture, my framed photographs on the walls, except that in the photographs, many of the ones that had featured me had been replaced with ones of Mara, and she said, very quietly, "You should go before Daniel gets home. This is going to be a lot harder if you're here when he gets home." I didn't understand what she meant. I didn't understand anything yet, but that wasn't even the worst part. Daniel came home 2 hours later. I had refused to leave. Mara had tried several more times to get me out of the apartment, escalating from quiet requests to something approaching frantic pleading, but I sat down on my own couch in my own apartment and I did not move. She went into the bedroom. I could hear her on the phone. I couldn't hear what she was saying. When Daniel walked through the door, the first thing I felt was love. Immediate, overwhelming 6 years of missing you love. He looked the same. Older in the way that makes people more themselves rather than less. He was carrying a grocery bag and wearing the jacket I had bought him before I left. He looked at me, and his expression was cautious, confused. Not the expression of someone seeing the person they love after 6 years apart. "Can I help you?" he said. Those 4 words. I said his name. I stood up. I started to cross the room toward him. He stepped back. Mara appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. She had been crying, or had made herself look like she'd been crying, I still don't know which, and she said, "She was waiting when I got home. I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry, I should have called you." Daniel looked between us. I watched him look between us, and I watched the confusion on his face shift into something else. Something guarded. Something that made my blood go cold. "Who are you?" he said to me. I told him my name. He told me that was his fiancée's name. And then I understood everything all at once, the way you sometimes understand things not piece by piece but in one crashing wave that takes your breath away and leaves you standing in the wreckage. My sister had not just been staying in my apartment. She had been living as me. If you've never had someone try to explain to you that your own name doesn't belong to you, I don't know how to make you understand what that moment feels like. Daniel was not cruel, he was not dismissive. He was genuinely trying to make sense of what he was seeing, 2 women who looked strikingly similar, one of whom he had been living with and loving for years, and one of whom had just appeared in his apartment and claimed to be the real version of someone he already knew. He called the police. I don't blame him for that. I want to say that now because this story is complicated and the blame in it belongs in very specific places, and Daniel is not one of them. He called the police because he was scared and confused, and because the woman he loved was standing there crying, and the woman he didn't know was sitting on his couch refusing to leave. 2 officers came. I explained who I was. I had my passport. I had my international work ID. I had documents going back years, all bearing my name and my face. The officers compared my documents to the documents Mara had been using, the ones she had either forged or obtained through fraud, and even then it took time to untangle because Mara had been thorough. Disturbingly thorough. She had my birth certificate. She had a copy of my social security number. She had credit cards in my name with an address change filed years before, which is how she had been building credit history as me while I was abroad. She had reached out to my former employer, the one I had left to take the international posting, and had used my references, my work history, and my academic credentials to get a job. Not my exact job, Something adjacent, but close enough that she had built an entire professional life on the foundation I had spent years constructing. And she had Daniel. That one I still struggle to explain. Because unlike the financial fraud, unlike the identity theft, the Daniel piece required something that documents alone couldn't provide. It required performance. It required knowing me well enough, my stories, my references, my habits, my history, to become me convincingly for the person who had known me most intimately. Would you have believed it was possible that someone could know you well enough to become you? I keep asking myself whether the signs were there in my conversations with Daniel over those 6 years. Whether there were moments where something was slightly off, a detail misremembered, a joke that landed wrong, a reference that felt borrowed from old conversations rather than lived. I don't know. The calls had been infrequent enough, and I had been distracted enough by the work that I might have missed it. Or maybe Mara was simply better at being me than I want to admit. The police confirmed my identity that night. They did not arrest Mara, not immediately. That process would take weeks and involve multiple agencies, but they made clear that she could not remain in the apartment and that an investigation had been opened. She left without much resistance. What she did do on her way out was look at Daniel and say very quietly, "I'm sorry. I love you." Not to me, to him. I stood there in my own apartment in my own life and watched the woman who had stolen 6 years of it say goodbye to the man I loved, who had no idea whether to believe anything that had happened that evening. That night, after the police left, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours. Not talking, not at first, just sitting. He made coffee. I didn't drink mine. We were both in shock, but we were in different kinds of shock. I was in the shock of someone who had just discovered the scale of what had been taken from her, and he was in the shock of someone whose entire reality had just been dismantled. He asked me questions. Dozens of them. Things only the real me would know, private things, things from before I left, things we had said to each other in quiet moments that had never been written down anywhere and couldn't have been stolen or forged. I answered every one. He listened. I watched him reassemble the truth piece by piece, watched him place 6 years of memories against the architecture of what he now knew had happened, watched him start to understand the size of what Mara had done. He didn't apologize that night. I didn't expect him to, but he didn't ask me to leave either, and that felt like something. If you're enjoying real stories like this, consider subscribing. There's more to this story, and more stories like it. The investigation took 8 weeks. In that time, I learned the full scope of what Mara had done, and it was worse than I had understood in those first disorienting hours. She had filed an address change on my credit cards within 3 months of my departure. She had run up nearly $40,000 across 4 accounts before they were frozen, not flagged as fraud initially, because the spending patterns were consistent with someone who had recently moved and was settling into a new living situation. She had contacted my former employer using a personal email address she had created under my name, offered my references and work history, and landed a position that paid well enough to sustain the life she was building. She had moved into the apartment I had sublet to a friend, my friend who had moved out after a year, and who Mara had somehow convinced to pass the lease to her again using my name. My friend later told investigators she had believed she was communicating with me. That the person she thought was me over email had sounded exactly like me, that she had no reason to question it. The proposal had happened 8 months before I came home. Daniel had taken Mara to a restaurant we had loved. Before I left a restaurant, I had mentioned to him in a call, a memory I had shared, which she had used, and had gotten down on one knee. She had said yes. There was a ring on her finger the day I walked through that door. A ring I hadn't noticed in the shock of the first moments that Daniel had looked at with something devastated in his eyes when we sat at the kitchen table. He had been engaged to my sister for 8 months. He had been in love with her for years. And she had let him knowing exactly what she was doing, knowing I would come home eventually, knowing this could not last forever. That is the part I will never fully understand. Not the logistics of the fraud I can trace, those I can follow, the decisions, I can see the planning and the opportunism. But the choice to let a man fall in love with her, genuinely fall in love with her, and never tell him the truth, that is something I cannot put inside any framework of human behavior that makes sense to me. I asked her about it eventually. I'll get to that. The second escalation began when news of the investigation started reaching the edges of my social network. People I had worked with before leaving, people who had known both Mara and me, people who had somehow believed over the years that I was in contact with them when I wasn't. Some of them had been receiving emails from Mara maintaining what they thought were ongoing friendships with me. Some of them had sent gifts when they thought I got engaged. Some of them had responded warmly to a Christmas card that had my name on it but was written in someone else's hand. When the truth came out, the reactions split roughly into two camps: people who were horrified and immediately reached out to me, and people who didn't quite believe it. The second group was smaller but louder. Some of them had known Mara long enough that they had built genuine affection for the version of me she was performing, and they weren't ready to let that go. There is something deeply strange about discovering that someone has not just stolen your identity in the legal sense, but has built relationships under your name that you then have to either claim or abandon. I had to make decisions about whether to reach out to people I had never actually spoken to, people who thought we had years of history together. I had to explain to a woman who thought she was my close friend that I had never met her. I had to read messages from someone who believed we had helped each other through grief that I had never sent. It is a particular kind of grief, losing a version of yourself you never got to be. Daniel and I were trying in those 8 weeks to find something solid to stand on. He came home to me every night, not to Mara, to me, and we were slowly, carefully building something new out of the rubble. It wasn't easy. He was grieving too in his way. He had loved someone. Whatever he had felt for the person he thought was me was real, even if the person wasn't. You can't just dismantle a feeling because you learn it was built on false foundations. Feelings don't work that way. He was patient with me. He asked questions about who I really was, the things he had missed in 6 years. He told me about the years without me, the ones Mara had been there for and the ones before she arrived. He told me when she had first showed up, which had been almost 8 months after my departure. He told me what she had said to explain her presence, which was a story about me asking her to check on the apartment. He told me how it had grown from there. He cried once, and I held him, and we didn't talk. Something was building again between us, something slow and cautious and real. It was nothing like what we'd had before I left, because that was gone. That particular version of us had been dismantled over 6 years and would never exist again. But what we were building was ours, in a way that nothing in those 6 years had been. And then Mara called. It was week 5 of the investigation. I was at the apartment, Daniel was at work. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, her voice was exactly as I remembered it: not guilty, not desperate, but controlled, like she had written a script and was delivering it. She asked if we could meet. I should have said no. Every rational part of me knew I should have said no, that anything she said would be used by her legal team, that nothing she could offer me would be worth the risk of that meeting. I knew all of that. I said yes anyway. We met at a coffee shop neither of us had been to before. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table without the ring. I noticed that immediately. She had taken the ring off. I don't know what it meant. Maybe nothing. She looked like me. She had always looked like me. We shared enough genetics for that, but sitting across from her in that coffee shop, I was struck by how far she had taken it. The hair, the style. Even the way she was sitting, which was the way I had always sat, slightly turned, shoulders squared. She had spent years being me so thoroughly that she had stopped knowing where the performance ended, and she began. I sat down. I didn't order anything. She said, "I want to explain." I said, "Then explain." What followed was 40 minutes that I have replayed so many times in the years since that I don't fully trust my memory of it anymore. But the substance is accurate. I know the substance. She told me that she had come to check on the apartment because she was in a bad place, broke recently out of a relationship, feeling like she had nowhere to go. She had intended to stay for 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks. She said that when she called some of my contacts to explain she was covering for me temporarily, one of them had assumed she was me, and she hadn't corrected it, just for that one call. And then the next time it had been easier, and the next time easier still. She said Daniel had come over one evening she hadn't been expecting him, and he had thought she was me. He had been so happy to see her that she couldn't bring herself to correct it. She had told herself it was temporary, that she would tell him the next day, then the next week, then the next month. She said she had fallen in love with him. And then she said something that has stayed with me unchanged in my memory, because I have never heard anything quite like it. I always thought you had everything, she said. Not because you took it from me, just because the world gave you things it never gave me. And I wanted to know what it felt like. I thought I would try it for a while. I thought maybe if I could feel what your life felt like, I would stop hating myself so much. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "Did it work?" She looked at her hands. "For a while," she said. And then I started to feel like I was disappearing. What would you have said in that moment? If the person who had stolen your entire life told you they'd done it because they hated themselves, would you have found any room for compassion? I genuinely don't know what the right answer is even now. I told her that I was sorry she had felt that way. I told her I was sorry that she had grown up feeling like the world was unequal between us, because I hadn't known that or hadn't let myself know it. I told her that none of it justified what she had done. Not to me, not to Daniel. Not to the dozens of people whose lives she had moved through wearing my face. I told her that I hoped the legal process would result in something that forced her to get help because I genuinely believed she needed it. But I told her that I couldn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She nodded. She hadn't expected forgiveness. I think she'd come to explain herself, not to ask for anything. She stood up to leave. And then she stopped with her back to me and she said quietly without turning around, "He loves you, the real you. He talked about you constantly in the beginning. I spent years learning everything he loved about you so I could be it. I just want you to know that he loved you the whole time. I don't think he ever stopped." She walked out. I sat there for a long time. The criminal charges were filed 7 weeks after my return. Identity fraud, financial fraud, impersonation, wire fraud. The list was long. Mara pleaded guilty to reduced charges. After months of negotiation, she received a sentence that included restitution, a suspended prison term conditional on a period of probation, and mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment. She did not go to prison, which is a complicated outcome, and one I've been asked about many times. I chose not to seek maximum prosecution. That was my choice to make, and I made it. Not because I forgave her. Not because what she did was less than what it was. But because I didn't want to spend what remained of my energy trying to destroy her. I wanted to spend it rebuilding. The financial damage was significant but not insurmountable. Most of the fraudulent credit accounts were discharged. One of the card companies was more resistant, and that battle took another year, but it was won eventually. My professional reputation took the strangest kind of hit. There were people in my industry who had briefly believed the version of the story Mara's legal team initially tried to push, which was that I was the impersonator, and even after it was clearly resolved, there is a particular shadow that follows any kind of fraud case. It took time. It required direct, uncomfortable conversations with people who had known me before I left. But it was rebuilt. Daniel and I are not together. I want to be honest about that because this story isn't a fairy tale, and I won't dress it up as one. We tried. We spent 8 months trying, and they were real months, honest and effortful and sometimes beautiful in the quiet way that things are when you're trying to save them. But the truth is that he had fallen in love with someone for 6 years, and that someone was gone, and I was a different person who happened to have the same name. He was grieving someone who had never existed, and I was grieving someone I had never gotten to be. We were doing 2 different kinds of rebuilding, and they didn't quite align. We ended things on a Tuesday evening in spring at the kitchen table where we had sat the night everything came apart, and it was sad but not devastating. We had both known for a while. We said things that were true and kind and necessary. He told me he was proud of me. I told him I was glad I'd gotten the chance to really know him, at least at the end. I haven't spoken to Mara since the coffee shop. I've been told she has completed treatment and is living somewhere I don't know the location of. I don't ask. That is my own act of self-preservation, and I make no apology for it. What I will tell you is this: I got my name back. All of it, the credit history, the professional record, the identity on paper. More importantly, I got myself back. The version of me that came home from 6 years overseas and had to fight to prove she existed. She is tougher than the one who left. She is less likely to let things go unexamined. She is less likely to assume that love means safety. But she is also surprisingly less angry than you might expect. Because here is the thing no one tells you about having your life stolen. Rebuilding it is yours entirely. No one else's footprints in it. No one else's version of what you should be. You get to decide what your life looks like when you build it from scratch, and there is something almost clarifying about that if you can find it underneath the grief. I found it. I am still finding it. If you're watching this and you've been through something where someone took something from you that felt irreplaceable, your identity, your relationship, your sense of security, I want you to know that the finding is real. It takes time. It takes more patience than most people think they have. But it's real. If stories like this mean something to you, a like genuinely helps this channel keep making them. My name is Claire. It has always been Claire. And it will always be mine.